Welcome back to the Timeless Investor Show. I'm Ari Van Gemeren, real estate fund manager, student of history, and your host today. The year is 1885, and you're looking at a map of Florida. South of Jacksonville, there's basically nothing. No cities, no hotels, no beaches lined with tourists, just endless swampland, alligators, and mosquitoes. And maybe a little bit of malaria thrown on top. The few people crazy enough to live there are mostly farmers struggling to grow oranges. But fast forward 30 years to 1915. That same swampland has become America's winter playground. Luxury hotels dot the coast. Trains carry wealthy tourists from New York to Key West. Palm Beach is the winter capital for America's richest families. Miami is a booming city. How did that happen? Well, it's rare, but sometimes in history it strikes. One man happened. Henry Morrison Flagler. Today we're going to talk about the most audacious real estate development project in American history. How a 55-year-old oil millionaire looked at a mosquito-infested peninsula and decided to build the railroad to paradise. This isn't just a story about trains and hotels. This is a story about creating value from nothing, using infrastructure to unlock land, and thinking so far ahead that people call you crazy. Because here's the thing about Flagler and why he's such an incredible person to explore in the Timeless Investor Show. He wasn't just a real estate developer. He created entire markets that didn't previously exist. This is the Timeless Investor Show. Let's dive in. Before we get to Florida, we need to understand where Flagler got the money to build a railroad through a swamp. Henry Flagler wasn't born rich. He grew up in a small town in upstate New York. His father was a Presbyterian minister who didn't make very much money, but Flagler had something more valuable than inherited wealth. He had the ability to see opportunities that others might miss or often missed. And so in 1867, when he was 37 years old, Flagler formed a partnership with a young businessman named John D. Rockefeller. They were building what would become known as Standard Oil. Now, I want to stop a second on my story and just highlight, I'm 38. Makes me feel great to hear that this gentleman got started at 37. Like when I learned that in the research to this story, it's just inspiring. I feel like today we have so many 22-year-old founders that are worth billions, and we think if we're 32, we're too late to the game. It is never too late to get into the game. Flagler was 37. He was 37. And many of you know Rockefeller's name, right? But most people don't realize that Flagler was essentially the co-founder of Standard Oil. He brought the business strategy, the financing, and the railroad connections that made the whole thing work. And Standard Oil became the most profitable company in American history up to that point. And Flagler owned quite a bit of it. So by 1881, when he was 51 years old, Flagler was one of the wealthiest men in America. He could have retired, he could have bought a yacht and spend his days playing golf and relaxing, but instead, he decided to build a railroad to nowhere. So here's how it got started. In 1878, Flagler's first wife was suffering from health problems. Their doctor recommended a warm climate, so they went to Florida for the winter. This was not an easy trip at the time. You had to take a train to Savannah, Georgia, and then a steamboat to Jacksonville, Florida. And from Jacksonville, if you wanted to go anywhere else in Florida, you were basically on your own. So when Flagler got to Jacksonville, he was appalled by what he found. The hotels were terrible. The transportation was worse. The whole place felt like the frontier, not like a destination for wealthy tourists. But Flagler saw something else there. He saw potential. Florida had perfect weather in the winter when the rest of America was freezing. It had beautiful beaches. It had land that was basically free because nobody wanted it. The only thing Florida really lacked was infrastructure, and Flagler knew how to build infrastructure. So most of us in this situation probably would have thought about let me build a hotel. Let me think about maybe buying some land and developing a resort. But Flagler thought bigger, much bigger. He realized that the opportunity wasn't just in Florida real estate. The opportunity was in creating the entire system that would make Florida real estate valuable. Think about it this way. What good is owning beachfront property if nobody can get to your property? Like maybe you have it, you and your family can enjoy it when you get there. But like if you're trying to make money, what's the benefit? Flagler's insight was that he needed to control the entire customer experience from New York to Key West, the transportation, the accommodations, the destinations. So he developed what we would call today a vertically integrated strategy. First, build a railroad to bring people to Florida. Second, build luxury hotels to give them somewhere to stay. Third, buy up land along the railroad route before anyone else realizes what's happening. And lastly, develop that land into cities and resorts. And it was brilliant. Every piece of the strategy reinforced every other piece. The railroad made the land valuable. The hotels created demand for the railroad. The land development generated passengers for both the railroad and the hotels. So in 1885, Flagler started construction on what he called the Florida East Coast Railway. People thought he was insane. The route he planned would run down the entire east coast of Florida, through swampland, over rivers, and eventually come across the ocean to Key West. Engineers told him it couldn't be built. Investors told him it would never make money. Local newspapers called it Flagler's folly. I think in general, if anyone calls something their name plus folly, you should go for it. Seward's folly. We acquired the entire state of Alaska for nothing, right? Nothing. How much gold and oil did we receive from that? Newspapers and people love to poo-poo innovative and interesting projects. It's probably our favorite pastime, but Flagler didn't care. He had enough money from Standard Oil to fund the entire project himself if necessary. And the construction was brutal. I mean, think about it. Workers had to drain swamps, they had to build bridges across rivers, and they had to lay track through areas where literally I don't want to say no human had set foot before, because the native tribes obviously had set foot there, but where no northern Americans had set foot before, white people, for lack of a shorter term, had set foot before. The workers had to deal with alligators, snakes, hurricanes, and diseases like malaria and yellow fever. Hundreds of workers died during the construction, but Flagler kept pushing south. Every time the railroad reached a new town, land values in that town would multiply overnight. What Flagler figured out was that every mile of railroad he built made the land around it more valuable. So he wasn't really in the railroad business. He was using the railroad to create valuable real estate. As the railroad progressed, Flagler built a series of increasingly elaborate hotels. Flagler built hotels that were more like attractions than places to stay. The Ponce de Leon Hotel in St. Augustine, completed in 1888, was called the most beautiful hotel in America. It had electric lights when most of America was still using gas. It had steam heat, modern plumbing, and a staff of hundreds. The Royal Ponciana Hotel in Palm Beach was even grander. When it opened in 1894, it was the largest wooden structure in the world. It could accommodate 1,750 guests and employed over 1,400 staff members. But here's what made Flagler different. He wasn't trying to make money on the hotels himself. The hotels were marketing. They were there to convince wealthy Americans that Florida was a sophisticated destination, not a wilderness. And so once people started coming to Florida for the hotels, they started buying land. And Flagler owned most of the land for sale. Not to mention the fact that every hotel he put together had thousands of people working at it that also needed somewhere to live, and Flagler controlled the land. So as Flagler's railroad pushed south, he essentially created cities along the route. Palm Beach didn't exist before Flagler. He built the town from scratch as a resort community for America's wealthiest families. Fort Lauderdale was a tiny trading post before the railroad arrived. Flagler developed it into a proper city. Miami was a settlement of about 300 people when Flagler's railroad reached it in 1896. Within a decade, it had become a major city. This is something, by the way, that would be almost impossible today, to create entire cities from nothing. But in Flagler's time, if you controlled the transportation, you could literally decide where cities would grow. And Flagler was smart about how he did it. He didn't just plop down a railroad station and hope for the best. He would buy up large tracts of land around where the station would be built. Then he would develop the land thoughtfully, laying out streets, building infrastructure, creating parks and commercial districts. He was essentially doing master plan community development on a massive scale. It reminds me a little bit of, when you have a rural town that's near a freeway, and then for whatever reason, the government decides to reroute the freeway and the town dies, or the the railroad decides to reroute the railroad and the town dies. And it's a movie trope. You see it all the time. What's unique about this is that Flagler controlled the railroad that gave the value to the land. So he's willing to invest in the railroad, but he had a completely vertically integrated structure to profit on every single piece of the thing. So this is, I think, one of the more interesting parts of the story, which is the Key West extension. See, by 1905, Flagler's railroad had reached Miami. And honestly, I think most people would have probably stopped at that point. You traversed the entire state. But Flagler was 75 years old and worth hundreds of millions of dollars. He could have declared victory and enjoyed his success. Instead, he announced his most ambitious project yet, extending the railroad across the water to Key West. This was engineering on a scale that had never been attempted. The railroad would have to cross 128 miles of open ocean, connecting a series of small islands with bridges and causeways. And everybody told him it was impossible. The engineering challenges were enormous, the cost would be astronomical, and Key West was just a small fishing village. Who would even want to go there? But Flagler had a different vision. He understood that Key West was only 90 miles from Cuba. If you could get a railroad to Key West, you could connect it to steamship lines to Havana. And suddenly, you have a direct transportation link from New York to Cuba. In an era when America was becoming interested in Caribbean trade, this would also be incredibly valuable. So construction began in 1905. It took 7 years and cost over $50 million, approximately $1.5 billion in today's money. The engineering was miraculous. Workers built massive concrete viaducts across the water. They survived multiple hurricanes, including one that killed over 400 people. And when the first train reached Key West in 1912, newspapers called it the eighth wonder of the world. Long stretch from Flagler's folly. Flagler at this point was 82 years old. He had spent the last 27 years of his life building a railroad through a swamp to a fishing village that most Americans had never heard of. And 1 year later, he was dead. This project was his magnum opus. He triumphed at a scale most people could never even dream of. And he basically built the state of Florida. So let me break down what Flagler actually accomplished from a business perspective, because this is one of, I think, the most brilliant real estate strategies in history. Flagler understood something that many developers probably intuitively understand, but it's progressively more difficult as time gets on. But land by itself isn't worth that much. What makes land valuable is having access to it. So before the railroad, Florida land was basically worthless. After his railroad, the same land was worth hundreds or thousands of times more. But here's the key, and this is the key that I've been harping on a lot in writing, in our podcasting, and every single thing I work on. Flagler didn't just build infrastructure and hope someone else would benefit. He controlled every piece of the value chain. He was vertically integrated in the best possible way. He owned the railroad that brought people to Florida. He owned the hotels where they stayed. He owned the land they fell in love with. He owned the development companies that sold them lots. So when wealthy New Yorkers came to Florida and decided they wanted to build winter homes, they had to buy land from Flagler's companies, transport materials on Flagler's railroads, and often stay in Flagler's hotels while their homes were being built. It was a perfectly integrated business model. Now, what made Flagler different from other developers was his timeline. Most developers wanted quick returns. Flagler was planning projects that would take decades to pay off. Most real estate developers want to buy land, develop it quickly, and sell it for a profit. Flagler was willing to spend decades building infrastructure before he saw significant returns. He understood that if you're creating an entirely new market, you do have to be patient. Now, to play devil's advocate with this point, most of us are not co-founders of Standard Oil, don't have infinite capital, and the ability to build all of the infrastructure that leads to a project. But there are developers, and we will cover them in future episodes, who did understand Flagler's lesson one way or the other, and they utilized it to bring the infrastructure, to do the work, to ally with the city, with municipalities, to do what they had to do. Flagler took tremendous risk to achieve this strategy, but he also had tremendous wealth to start. So there's some aspects of the story that are a little more difficult for your average investor getting started today to really deploy in their own strategy, but I still think there's a lot of stuff to take away from it. So Flagler's strategy to this point has been repeated many times since, but rarely on such a grand scale. Walt Disney did something similar when he bought Disney World in Orlando. He bought up thousands of acres of swampland in secret, and then he built the infrastructure to make that land incredibly valuable. I would argue Elon Musk is doing something similar with his various companies. Tesla's Gigafactories are located in places where Musk also owns large amounts of land. The Boring Company builds tunnels that just happen to connect to properties that Musk is involved with. In real estate development today, the most successful developers, in my opinion, understand Flagler's core insight. You don't just develop the land, you develop the infrastructure that makes the land valuable. For example, when Amazon chooses a location for a new headquarters, they're not just thinking about operating costs. They're thinking about how their presence will affect local real estate values. And when tech companies build campuses in areas like Austin or Nashville, they're not just looking for talent. They're creating the conditions that will make their real estate investments more valuable over time. And they can control the inputs that make these things more valuable. Another great example I always loved is the story about the development of the meatpacking district, right? I mean, the meatpacking district in Manhattan was valuable real estate, I guess, if you look through time and history. But at the time that it was being developed, and I can't remember the name of the developer off the top of my head, but one thoughtful developer started in secret buying up plots of land and then helped put together a huge project at the center of the meatpacking district that basically massively catalyzed the value of the land all around it. So it's a unique and valuable strategy. What I think the approaches I see a lot of developers do today is so-and-so city's growing. I'm gonna build an apartment complex in the middle of it. I mean, it works, right? It works. We don't do it that way. That's not our investing strategy, but it does work. But it's not the way to like tremendous wealth the way these guys took it on. But that's because people don't have the risk appetite. So let's talk about Flagler's risks. Let's talk about what he took on because they were enormous. Flagler spent roughly $100 million of his own money on Florida development. That's about $3 billion in today's money. And for most of that time, there was no guarantee that people would actually want to come to Florida. Tourism to warm climates wasn't really an established thing yet. Air conditioning didn't exist, so most people assumed that warm climates were automatically unhealthy. The engineering challenges were massive. Nobody had ever built a railroad through the Everglades or across open ocean. Hurricanes, diseases, economic panics, any of these could have destroyed the entire project. So Flagler was betting not just his money, but his reputation and his legacy. But the rewards were proportional to the risks. By the time Flagler died in 1913, his Florida investments were worth far more than he had spent on them. The towns he had created were thriving. The land he had bought for pennies an acre was selling for hundreds of dollars an acre. And more importantly, he literally created an entirely new industry, Florida tourism, that would generate billions of dollars in economic activity for the next century and never stop. So what did he get right? Let me break down the key principles that made this strategy click. First, he understood infrastructure value. Most people see infrastructure as a cost. I think Flagler saw it as a competitive advantage. Second, he thought in decades, not years. This is something we talk about a lot on the Timeless Investors show. Flagler was willing to spend 30 years building something before he expected major returns. That kind of patience is extremely rare, but it often separates great investors from good ones. Third, he controlled the entire value chain. Talked about it ad nauseum. I won't dig into it more, but this is very important. Fourth, he created markets instead of just participating in them. So like I said before, many developers will just build buildings in the middle of a growing city, but Flagler was adept at creating the demand where none had existed before. And lastly, he wasn't afraid to be early. Flagler started building in Florida when most people thought it was uninhabitable. Being early allowed him to buy land cheaply and position himself perfectly for when demand eventually materialized. I want to say one thing on this note as well. Ego and pride and not wanting to be embarrassed are reasons that people don't take on risk. There's money risk and there's reputational risk. Now, you cannot survive going bankrupt on money, but you can survive to an extent. You can survive reputational risk. Flagler was a man that doesn't seem to me, in the reading of his history, to have cared particularly much about reputational risk. For example, his second wife began to exhibit severe mental health issues. And at some point when he was I believe in his early 70s, he divorced her and married his 31-year-old secretary, which was incredibly scandalous. And I am not saying this to say bravo for him. He took a bold stand. I'm not saying that at all. What I'm saying is he was willing to take the reputational blowback. He didn't care. So not caring, not being too affected by what people think about you, not being too affected by the newspaper. They called it Flagler's folly. Many of us would have wilted at that. I know I might have, right? I mean, social ridicule and scorn is really difficult to deal with. I don't know that this is true, but from the reading of the story, from understanding what he's done, his ability to withstand public scrutiny, reputational risk, and ridicule were at a very high level. There's something we can learn from that. So that's the first thing I want us to take away from stories that matter today. The second piece of it, from what we can learn from his story, is that infrastructure still creates value, but we might be talking about broadband internet, electric vehicle charging stations, transit-oriented development, thoughtful deployment of solar panel arrays and new product, or even old product. It all matters. Second of all, integration still matters tremendously. I have come to believe that the most successful real estate companies today are not just investors in real estate. They control various parts of the value chain. And I just think it's incredibly important. Thirdly, patience still pays off. In this era, we have instant gratification, social media. It's easy to forget that the biggest real estate fortunes in history were built over decades, not a 3 to 5 year span. Creating markets is more profitable than competing in existing markets. Totally true. Hard to execute in reality, and I think the risk is probably beyond most of our ability to do so. But if you can find somewhere, if you're a developer and you can find somewhere where you can create the conditions for future demand, it can be worth going after it. So look, Flagler died in 1913, just 1 year after his railroad reached Key West. He was 83 years old and had spent almost 30 years building his Florida empire. In a cruel irony, the railroad to Key West, his greatest engineering achievement, was actually destroyed by a hurricane in 1935. The state of Florida bought the right-of-way and converted it into a highway, which became the famous overseas highway that still connects to Florida Keys today. But Flagler's real legacy wasn't his railroads. It was the transformation of Florida from a wilderness into a destination. Today, Florida is the third most populous state in America. Tourism is a $100 billion industry. Real estate development is one of the state's largest economic sectors. None of that would have happened without Henry Flagler's vision and willingness to spend decades building infrastructure that nobody else thought was important. So Henry Flagler teaches us that the biggest real estate fortunes can and do often come from creating value, not just capturing it. Anyone can buy land where demand already exists, but creating demand where none existed before, that is one of the places that genuine generational wealth can be built. Flagler looked at a swamp and he saw paradise. He looked at transportation problems and he saw business opportunities. He looked at infrastructure costs and saw competitive advantages. Most importantly, he was willing to spend decades building something that other people said was impossible and willing to do it with his own money. That kind of vision, patience, and execution is rare, but when it works, it transforms not just the investor's wealth, but it can transform entire regions and industries. As modern real estate investors and timeless investors, we can't all build railroads across oceans, but we can learn to see opportunities where others see problems. We can learn to think in decades instead of years. And we can learn that sometimes the best investments are the ones that everybody else thinks are crazy. Next week, we're going to explore another fascinating chapter in American real estate history, how John D. Rockefeller used Standard Oil profits to build a real estate empire that his family still benefits from today. Until then, remember, think well, act wisely, build something timeless. Thank you for listening to the Timeless Investor Show. If you enjoyed this episode, please share it with someone who appreciates ambitious thinking and long-term vision. And if you haven't already, please subscribe to the Timeless Investor newsletter where we explore these themes in even greater depth. Lastly, if you don't mind leaving a review for the show on whatever your podcasting service is, it would be tremendously helpful. It helps the show to grow and it helps us to reach a broader audience. I'm Ari Van Gemeren, and I'll see you next week. Thank you for being here.